Thank you for joining today's webinar, Sheep Blowfly Sterile Insect Technique Project. My name's Jodie Rosé-O'Brien and I'm one of the AWI Extension South Australia team. Today's webinar is made possible by support from Australian Wool Innovation, the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund, the Department of Primary Industries and Regions. If you'd like more information on AWI Extension South Australia, you can go to our website and follow us on socials. Our speaker today is Dr. Maarten Van Helden from SARDI. Maarten's been working with SARDI in Adelaide since 2016. Maarten originates from the Netherlands, where he did his PhD at Wageningen Agricultural University. He worked in France as an associate professor at Bordeaux University on integrated pest management in viticulture. He is currently dividing his time between a grains pest R&D, including the Pest Facts South Australia newsletter that many of you would receive, and the Blowfly project. Thanks, Maarten.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I will try to explain a little bit what we are trying to develop in this project, which we call LuSIT, Lucilia SIT, trying to develop sterile insect technique for flystrike. I'm the one presenting, but of course, there's a whole team behind me. I'll have a few names at the end. This is quite a big project that's happening at the moment on Kangaroo Island. So content, I'll try to explain very briefly what blowflies and flystrike are, but I presume most people will know that. I'll talk about the project on Kangaroo Island, the results we've had over the last season, the planning for the coming years, and then maybe more important, how are we going to use this on the mainland if it works as we think it should be, because this is just a pilot study. It's a big pilot study, but it's just a pilot study. The aim is to develop this for applications on the mainland. And then, of course, that's all depending on how much does it cost, how much benefit does it give to the farmers. And that's the subject of the last few slides that I will show today. Okay, sheep blowfly. Everybody who has been in touch with sheep probably knows what it is, and everybody dislikes it very much. It's a fly, a very specific species, Lucilia cuprina, the Australian sheep blowfly. It's not an Australian fly. It's the Australian sheep, with it is being a blowfly. This species is actually introduced in Australia, probably from South Africa, but that's nowadays it's present all over the world. It's giving a lot of problems in Australia because of the sheep we have, merino sheep, which are very sensitive. So it's a fly, so a very simple cycle. Adult fly lays eggs. Eggs develop into maggots that are annoying on your sheep. If you go fishing, you can use them as bait. At the end of their development on the sheep, they jump, they leave the sheep. They go into the ground where they pupate and they develop into adult flies. So in temperate climates, like on Kangaroo Island, there is quite a period in the year that they are actually overwintering in the soil. So basically between June and October, the pupae will be in the ground, the pre-pupae and the pupae will be in the ground, and they will emerge normally mid-October on Kangaroo Island. So during the rest of the year, the fly can do multiple cycles, especially if the conditions are good for its development, which sometimes, unfortunately, they are. And if the sheep are sensitive to it, then it can be quite a big problem. There's a lot of flystrike research that has been done and is still ongoing. There's work on a flystrike vaccination approach. That's work done by CSIRO and some other institutes. That's been going on for the last 30 years, I think. Interesting, scientifically speaking. Unfortunately, they're not making as much progress as they would like to. And we'll see how that goes in the future. There's a lot of work on breeding less sensitive sheep. So try to get a little bit less wrinkly sheep. But at the same time, we know that merinos give so much wool because they are so wrinkly. So that's a bit of a contradiction in trying to get there, but there is good progress. There have been people working on the mass trapping of the flies to basically catch all the flies in the area. That's pretty challenging because the flies are not very numerous, and can you attract them to a fly rather than a very attractive, messy sheep, which they prefer. Some work on alternative treatment options like microencapsulation of pesticides or tea tree oil. These are all different projects. What we are looking into is what's called sterile insect technique, which is not new in the sense of other people have tried it. There was a big project by CSIRO in the 1970s that was actually rather complicated in the way they tried to achieve the results. And in the end, it turned out to be too complicated. It didn't work. But for this specific fly, there are SIT projects going. And there's one project which has been running for quite a long time in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh doesn't have much sheep. Actually, there in Bangladesh, it's a problem in the drying fish industry. So the flies lay their eggs on the drying fish. The maggots develop on the drying fish, which is not very nice. So in the past, they solved that by dipping the drying fish into insecticide solution, which is not very attractive either. So they've been doing SRT on a small scale on some small islands for quite a few years with good results. And this plus other considerations made that we at SARDI did a study for MLA and proposed them to run a study on Kangaroo Island to develop this technique again in a, what I would say, in a simple, very traditional approach, but which should be working fine. So how does it work? Sterile insect technique? Well, it's actually a very simple technique. It uses the fact that most fly species will mate only once in their life. Females will mate only once in their life. So if they mate with a sterile male, then they will not lay eggs. So all you have to do, if you want to do sterile insect technique, is to create huge numbers of sterile male flies. You release them, they mate with the fertile females in the wild, and those females cannot lay eggs. It sounds pretty simple. The question is, how do you produce so many flies? How do you sterilize so many flies? And how do you release so many flies? And that's a bit tricky. And you also have to be sure that the flies are actually good quality, because if the males that you release are not competing with the wild males, it doesn't work. So basically what we're trying to create is some kind of huge army of Superman flies that go out in the country and are quicker than the wild flies in mating with the females. So we've been doing that in SARDI for years already on Queensland fruit fly and Mediterranean fruit fly. We know that those techniques work. This is a new species, sheep blowfly for us. A very different context, of course, because this is livestock industry. But it should work, and previous experiments before we started this project have shown that it should work. Now the question is, can we achieve the production, the sterilization, and the release of the flies as it should be done? So that's our aim in the LuSIT project, to develop a simple and cost-efficient sterile insect technique for blowfly in Australia. Simple and cost-efficient, that's important for me. We try to keep it all as simple. I always say that we have a KISS approach, keep it simple and sustainable. And we're making good progress, as I'll show you later on. So mass production of the flies, sterilize them, release them. There's typically something quite new that we are doing, because we are not releasing adult flies, but we are releasing the pupae from the plane. So that's a big change compared to earlier programs. Of course, when we do that, we need to measure the effects. So we do a lot of monitoring of flies and flystrike on the island. And we want to know how much benefit this actually gives to the farmers, and how that benefits can be achieved. It's not just reduction of treatment and flystrike, but there's a couple of other elements that you need to take into account. So cost-benefit analysis, this is an expensive project. I'll show you some data at the end. It's an expensive project, but it's also relatively cost efficient if you look at the total area where we will be achieving control of the flystrike. Kangaroo Island, why did we choose Kangaroo Island? Island situation is ideal for scientific research because you have less flies coming in from the outside. The sheep density is good. We have roughly 500,000 sheep on Kangaroo Island. And we think that with this technique, we can even achieve eradication on Kangaroo Island, which is a big plus, of course, for the KI farmers. We will never achieve that on the mainland, but if we learn enough from the Kangaroo Island approach, then we can at least regulate the flies on the mainland at a level that is so low that flystrike should be very rare. The idea is that after this project, we're going to move elsewhere. And we are already thinking about that, even though it's a bit early because we don't have all the results of this project. So the first thing to do was to build a factory, what we call the facility, on Kangaroo Island. And we wanted to keep it simple and cheap. So we opted for a system that's completely based on shipping containers. So the drawing that you see here shows the setup. We have an adult hole at the top part in the middle and a larval hole at the bottom. And then you have larval rooms, adult rooms, storage, waste management, etc., etc. If you want to do this kind of work, you need a efficient facility that can produce a lot per square meter, because otherwise it's going to be too expensive. And of course, we are here in Australia in a situation where labor has a certain cost. Similar facilities for other species exist elsewhere in the world. They usually are in very low labor countries, so they can have 200 staff members. We in our facility are trying to get along with as few people as possible, which means you need to think the whole process through and try to make it as efficient as possible. So inside the facility, just a few pictures from what we do. Can't go into the detail, but in 2025, we produced 123 million pupae. Just to give you an idea, that's about 4 tons of pupae. Roughly 100 million were released over the island over 12 weeks. The releases are being done from a plane that you can see on the right side at the middle photo. It's a Cessna, has some modifications, exactly the same plane as the one being used for the fruit flies. We just have a different release machine in there. And luckily, because we release the pupae, it's a lot easier to get the flies in the plane than for the fruit flies, where they have to bring in the adult flies, which is really way more difficult, of course, to achieve. So what we release is what you see on the top right. That's the pupae. Those weird colors are actually a dye that we apply to try and mark them, so we can see which are the flies that we have released and which are the flies that are wild flies. On the left side, a few photos from the inside of the facility. It's all very simple, just very simple cages, very simple lighting conditions, very simple climate control. We try to go for something which is really as low tech as possible. There is, however, some very expensive equipment on the middle photo. You can see what's called the irradiator. So this is the machine that we use to sterilize the flies. We do that using X-rays, which has the big advantage that it's something you can turn on and off. So there's very little risk for leakage of radiation, and the flies are sterilized quite efficiently in those machines. And yeah, we can prepare our flies quite efficiently. So what can you do with the releases that we had in 2025? So we did 12 weeks of releases, and we had roughly 8 million flies for every week. So we were able to cover Dudley, the Dudley Peninsula on the east side of Kangaroo Island completely. And we also did a central band over the island, which was more of a research approach in the sense of we wanted to see if our flies were moving in and out of that band a lot. We did not expect to achieve good control of the flies in that central band, simply because there's also fertile flies coming in from the outside. So we were mainly focusing on the Dudley for the result of our releases to see if it worked or not. So we did 12 weeks of releases. Why only 12 weeks? Well, first of all, we want to do that as early in season as possible, because that's when the population of the flies is low. So the outnumbering is easier. And we stopped in December. Any later than December, you get into really warm temperatures, and that's not very easy for us to release the pupae and avoid that they get cooked on the ground. And we already saw that in our last release when it was actually a bit too warm. So very few of the pupae that we released actually hatched. So photo of the island, as you can see with those lines in the drawings, that's where the plane actually went over. So the flight paths of the plane are 4 kilometers apart, and that's 1 week. And then in the Next week, we come back in between those lines. So in the end, there's roughly 2 kilometers between the release lines. Flies can move that distance quite easily. So we hope to get a relatively even spread of the flies. All those pins that you see, the green pins, the yellow pins, they were all traps that we used to actually monitor how many flies there were in the different areas, and if we could see flies moving into the areas where there's no releases, or how much the outnumbering was in the area where we did releases. So fly trapping is relatively simple. Maybe some of you still remember the old LuSIT traps that existed. They were quite horrific to use because the dye was really, sorry, the bait in the traps was really horrific and very, very stinky. We use a much simpler trap that's made indoors, in-house. Like I said before, we dye our pupae with the fluorescent powder. Most of the weeks we used the magenta, the dark purplish color that you see. A couple of weeks we used yellow. In each area of releases, so Dudley, East, Central, and West, we had about 20 traps that we went to check every 2 weeks over the whole period, and we're still checking them at the moment. And then you have to sort out the flies because it's not very specific for Lucilia. We catch roughly 6 to 8 different species of flies in there. So we have some people in the lab that just go through all those thousands of flies that we trap, which is quite a big job. But let's look at some results. So just a reminder, in the central area and the Dudley area, that's where we release our flies. So the red lines are the marked flies, and you can see that there are clearly a lot of marked flies in those 2 areas. Not necessarily exactly the same number, but still. And you can also see that in the east and the west area, where we did not release any flies, there's very little of those red flies. If you're critical, you'll say, yeah, wait a minute, on the bottom left, you have quite a few flies in the east. Yeah, that was a bit of an accident because that was actually the trap that is closest to the airport. And we clearly spilled a few pupae when we were releasing our flies. So they got into that trap, which is, yeah, not what we wanted, but that's how it was. What you can also see is that we have a lot of unmarked flies in the central and the Dudley area, more than we would have in the east and the west area. Initially, we didn't understand why that was, but we now know that it's actually a certain percentage of our flies that do not get the dye on them. So most of the flies that you see on the blue or green line are still our flies that we've released in those areas. What is important is that if you look at the captures in the beginning of 2026 until now on Dudley Peninsula, there's almost not a fly that we have found back. And that's a very strong indication that something has happened and that we have reduced the fly population, which is important. Saying that, it's probably more important that we reduce flystrike than that we reduce the fly population. So we will also be looking at that. So for the fly trapping, we had a good outnumbering. Many flies were seen in the release areas, very few flies in the areas outside. Excellent fly reduction on Dudley. We had very few flies that actually went into the areas where we did not release, which is good. And we also could see from how long after release did we catch green flies, for example, how long they lived. And we could see that in our case, most of the flies, the highest number of flies were captured in the first 3 weeks after the releases. And then in some cases up to 4, maybe 5 weeks. But that's about it, which is what you expect as a life expectancy of an adult fly in nature. In the lab, we can keep them alive much longer, but yeah, there's no birds eating them and things like that. So fly strike monitoring. So that's something we had some difficulties with at the start to get that organized. We now do it with interviews. We have 20 farmers in each area that we call every 2 weeks, at the moment every month. And we ask very simple questions about how much fly strike have you seen? Are there any specific explanations for that? And of course, we wanted to have enough sheep in the survey, so we went mainly for the bigger farmers. As you can see in the little table, that's the number of sheep per area that are in our interviews. So total of 270,000 sheep, so that's 50% of the sheep population. That's a pretty good sample that we're doing there. So we're quite happy with that. And Casey Gove in my team is interviewing the farmers. and she'll get you on the phone. If you're not replying immediately, then she'll get again, and yeah, she gets the information out of you, which is great. We have also the request to the farmers to sample maggots for us. For some reason, they don't seem to like that too much. We have a few farmers that collect a lot of maggots for us, great. But we would like to have way more samples of maggots that we can actually take back to the lab and identify the flies on. So what did we see as fly strike? This is a bit of a complicated graph. So you have the 4 areas again, Dudley, East, Central, and West, over the period from 15th of October until the end of April. So that's basically the last results we have. And as you can see, Dudley is clearly the area where there is very little fly strike. In the West, there was also very little fly strike at the beginning of the year, but since, say, end of Feb, we've seen a clear increase in the East, Central, and Western area of fly strike, and especially in the West, there's a few properties that have heaps of fly strike at the moment. Whereas on Dudley Peninsula, you can see there's no strike or very little strike. So that is giving us some pretty good indication that the SIT is actually working. I'm not saying we have completely eradicated, but we have made really good progress. And that's what you expect with SIT. It's also interesting to note that this effect is already 3 months since we have stopped releasing. So the after effect of SIT is pretty good. This is giving us a lot of hope that this will work. That's what I just said. Significant increase in March, April, where we had more than almost 0.5% of fly strike in the rest of the island, and on Dudley only 0.03% of strike. So good result of 12 weeks of releases, almost complete elimination on Dudley. It's a bit difficult to get reliable data on fly strike because it was not a real fly strike year until February, March, April. So we now have some pretty good indications. So that was the results from last year, which now brings us to what are we going to do over the next few years? And we have to be realistic in what we can actually achieve with what we have as production of flies. So producing flies is an interesting job. The people that work in that facility are doing an amazing job, and it's physically quite hard. As you can imagine, it's also quite stinky. It's warm, it's humid, but they managed to produce 10 million flies in 2025, and we are now scaling up even further. So we hope to produce 15 million flies a week in 2026, 20 million in 2027, and 25 million in 2028. And that's what we need for what we plan to do on the island in the coming years. It's not that easy to scale up because obviously nobody's ever done that at this scale. So all the equipment, all the rearing approaches, we all need to develop it ourselves. We need to test it ourselves. And that's not always easy. At the same time, like I said, we need to be aware that we have a certain number of staff. We need to make sure that they can work in safe conditions. And we don't want to have too much staff, not only because that's expensive, but also because if there's too many people in this small area of the facility, which is not that big, there's actually an issue with traffic jam and collisions. So we need to work on that. So we think the upscaling is feasible in steps. We have good results. Now, how are we going to do that over the rest of the island? And what we are proposing is what's called the rolling carpet approach. I'll explain that a little bit later, which is also the way how we would approach it on the mainland. So I think this is really a good test. We simply cannot produce enough flies to cover all of KI in one go. So a rolling carpet approach is probably much better and much more realistic and closer to the reality of what we could do on the mainland. So what's a rolling carpet approach? You cover one part of the island in year one. That's what we did last year, Dudley 2025. And then in the next season, we're going to move westwards. So over the eastern part of what we call the main island. And we will focus only on the grazing country, pastoral area. And we will actually reduce the releases on Dudley to only half the dose. So with the 15 million flies that we think we can produce, we can do that. And then the year after, we would cover the rest of the pastoral country on Kangaroo Island. We would release half the density on the eastern part of the pastoral country. And then in 2028, we would cover all of the island, but only at half the dose. So that's an approach that is a little bit complicated, but it's really interesting as far as, like I said, close to the reality of what we could do on the mainland. It does require a few extra years and some extra funding. So we're still negotiating with the funding bodies to try and get that money to us. I'm quite optimistic that we will achieve that. I hope so. And yeah, we think that this approach is still able to achieve eradication on KI, which of course is a big value for the KI farmers, but it's also the best way to prepare for applications on the mainland. Just a little animation of how that should work. 2025 done. Next year, the pastoral country on the eastern part of the main island. The year after, we will do the western part of the main island pastoral country. We might have to adapt a little bit there because of the bushfires and the forest that has been transformed, is being transformed into grazing country again, but we'll see that. And then in the last year, we would cover all of the island with half the dose. So we've discussed that largely with our science committee, which includes people from all over the world, and everybody agrees that that's really the best approach. So that's what we're trying to achieve. The reason why we also need to cover the nature reserves like Cape Gantome and Flinders Chase is that we know that there are flies in there, low numbers, but there are flies in there. So feasible, gradual production increase, and that aligns with this goal. We can still eradicate, acceptable for the KI community. And if we produce more than we think, we can always cover a bit more. So that's also more realistic than we initially thought. We thought we would be able to produce more flies than we in reality can. So what's the kind of information we get out of that? I think it's important to understand that, and because that's really information that is useful for after this project. This is just a pilot. We want to understand if we can eradicate and how long the effect is of a production. So we've already seen this year on Dudley that if you stop in December, you still have good control over the rest of the season. We also think that it actually goes on into the next year, but that remains to be shown. So that's something we will try to monitor over the coming few years. We're interested in those range and rate of recolonization from areas where we don't release. So that's what we clearly can do over the next few years with the traps that we have. We will try different release rates, so the half dose and the full dose. We've seen already from the recapture that the flies seem to prefer certain habitats, like certain valleys more than other areas. So that's something we have very little understanding of. So we'll try and see if that is information that can be used to, for example, release more in specific areas. We are very interested in the effect of the nature areas, the non-pastoral habitat. And it's actually not just the nature areas, it's also the townships, for example. There's hardly the Lucilia in the townships. And then, of course, we need to work on the quality of our released flies. We need to make sure that our men are up to the job. And there's quite a bit of work to do in that sense. This all, we think, will give us the best information to prepare for application of sterile insect technique on the mainland. There's another element which is quite important, is that farmers can adapt the way they manage their flock if fly strike is reduced. So that practice change is not something we will achieve in the first year. That's something that will take time. And we are actively monitoring that. There is a study on our project to look at how farmers will change. And we are going to organize workshops with farmers to discuss with them if they consider certain changes and how they will apply them. And in the end, we also need to know how much it actually costs to do SIT at this scale. It's a bit difficult to know that precisely. Of course, at the moment, we're doing a lot of research work behind the scenes, which also costs a bit of money. But we estimate at the moment that this will cost roughly $6 to $10 per hectare per year. Is that the value that a farmer would attribute to having no flystrike? That's a question that we will have to work on. We think it is, but we'll see how the farmers think about it. In the meantime, we're doing quite a bit of other research in trying to find other solutions, like could we maybe eliminate all the females from our rearing? That would be great. Well, at least for the released flies, not in the cages where we want them to reproduce, to produce new flies. Can we sex the eggs and eliminate the eggs from the rearing, which would reduce a lot of diet because we don't have to rear all the males, etc. So there's a lot of research going on behind the scenes, which is quite often not even in this project, but is parallel projects. So, and I think that's it's essential that everybody understands that this is really to develop it also for using SIT on the mainland. How are we going to do that on the mainland? Well, that remains to be considered. That's depending on where we go. That's depending on how many flies we have. But roughly, it's probably going to be a little bit like a rolling carpet approach, except that we would call it an expanding area. That's what's in the name. So basically, you can start on an area with 25 million flies a week. You can do 2,500 square kilometers. To give you an idea, that's a 56-kilometer circle, or 50 by 50 kilometers square. That's quite big. You could do a full release in that area in the first year, and then you could, as we do on Kangaroo Island, reduce the release rate to 50% and expand by 1,250 square kilometers and so on. So you can have a bigger and bigger area under SIT control. That's exactly what has been done, for example, in the North and South America, where they have pushed back a infestation with a screw-worm fly, which is quite similar to blowfly. But screw-worm fly that was in Texas, and over, I think, 40 years, they've pushed that back to Panama. And of course, Panama is a very narrow passage, so the risk of flies going over that passage is actually much less than if you have a really big, large area. So that's one of our big examples, which we can find inspiration for this project. We will certainly be considering other things, like can we use it in a different context? Can we use it in low density areas where there's very few sheep, by maybe focusing on areas where the sheep are, water sources, sheep camps, sheep sheds, those kind of things. So there's a lot of research that can be done after this project. At the moment, we really need to focus on Kangaroo Island. So this is just a visual presentation. By coincidence, I've put this on the southeast. No, it's not by coincidence. That's because that's a high density sheep area. Roughly, I think the equivalent of, let's say, $6 to $10 a hectare is probably the value of 2 sheep management per year. So if you have a density of more than 2 heads per hectare, it's certainly interesting. And in an area like the southeast, is a very high density area. I think there are 4 heads a hectare on average. In this case, I've just drawn the circles on there very roughly, but it gives you a bit of an idea about how much you can actually cover with what we do here in a couple of years. And that's based on what we can produce in the facility as we have it on PI at the moment. Of course, the tricky bit there is this is a research project that is funded by industry bodies. If we go and do this in an area on the mainland, the farmers or some organizations supporting the farmers will have to fund that. And that is still relatively high cost in total. It's just not very expensive per hectare, because that's so far still a pretty acceptable price, I think. Just to give you an idea about how much money are we actually consuming. So the facility, roughly $4.5 million with equipment, that's $2 million. For the production and the releases, at full capacity, we think it'll cost roughly $2.7 million a year. So in total, over the 7 years of the project that we are hoping to do, that would add up to something like $17 million. Quite a big amount of money, but with that, we are able to do all of KI, which is 4,500 square kilometers. In total, over those 7 years, that comes back to less than $40 a hectare. Or for routine SIT, we think we are roughly $6 to $8 per hectare per year. So that is, for an SIT system, extremely cheap. That's because of the way we've organized it. If you think about fruit flies, you're talking about hundreds of dollars per hectare. One of the reasons is that they release the adult flies, which makes it much more expensive. Plus the fact that they have to release much higher densities. I think they are releasing 1,500 flies per hectare, whereas we do 100 pupae per hectare. So that makes it a lot more expensive per hectare. The question is then for a farmer, how much does it actually cost you? And that's an interesting question because people don't have a very clear idea of that. The latest estimate was done by Shepherd et al. In 2022, and they decided that it was roughly 320 million per year in Australia, which meant something like $4 to $5 per head per year. I know these guys, and they are very good scientists to have calculated this. And still, this is not a complete study because this is only looking at what we call the direct cost. So that's prevention, mulesing, chemicals, losses in sheep, losses in production, wool and meat, fertility, all those kind of things. But that's not all. There's way more behind flystrike. So I think we should not forget about those hidden costs. And I'll give you a bit of an impression on the next slide, even if we do not always quantify them very reliably. But if you don't have non-mulesed wool, you're missing value. At the moment, I think it's 150 cents a kilo of wool premium for non-mulesed sheep. So that's clearly something that's extra cost. What do you make of a merino sheep? 4.5, 5 kilos of wool. So that adds another $7 or $8 a sheep. You could potentially adapt your stocking rate if you have a control of flystrike and you don't have those numbers falling when there is flystrike. You can think about your enterprise mix. Can I have more merino sheep? And you can actually think about planning your whole calendar of events on the farm. When do you do lambing? When do you do shearing? Typically, at the moment, everybody wants to shear before the problems arrive, which means that everybody on KI wants the shearing teams to be ready in the same month. Well, that doesn't work. So there's big problems there, and I think it's the same everywhere. So yeah, there can be quite significant cost reductions, which means extra money gained for the farmer, benefits for the farmer from these kind of adaptations. And Richard Shepherd and John Webb-Ware, or Angry as most people know him, have done quite a bit of work on that, and they think there's a lot of extra value in these things if the farmers adapt their way of managing the farm. And then, of course, there's non-monetary value, animal health and well-being. Everybody wants to get rid of mulesing. It's not very nice to do. And a sheep that is sick is certainly unhappy. The farmers, the farmer workers, the shearers, they all would prefer not to have to handle sheep that are fly-struck. It's absolutely horrific. Chemical treatments and the environment is an issue. And of course, the social license for the sheep industry. The industry wanted to get rid of mulesing a long time ago, and unfortunately, they still haven't managed to do that. I think that's the end of my presentation. I just have to thank my whole awesome team on Kangaroo Island at Wade Campus, and also the other staff at PIRSA on Kangaroo Island, and of course all the bodies that are helping us, MLA, Australian Wool Innovation, the Sheep Industry Fund, Animal Health Australia, and the University of Adelaide and SARDI. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maarten. That's fantastic. Such an interesting talk. Maarten, first question is, how would you choose the area on the mainland to where you would set up the SIT facility, or where you would do the sterile insect technique?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the cost for SIT are cost per hectare. So you need to have an area that has a relatively acceptable quantity of sheep per hectare. Like I said, probably at this stage, 2 sheep per hectare to cover the cost, at least. And we also need a continuous area that's big enough because, I mean, all the actions that are being done, like the plane has to come over, has to load the flies, that only is efficient if the scale is big enough to do this. You can't do this just on one property. That's not going to be efficient. So we would be looking initially at the high density sheep area in South Australia, because that's where we are working, but maybe other areas are also interested in this.
Yeah, interesting. Sure, there's some growers out there thinking about their areas. Next question is, what's the risk once you've eradicated the fly from KI successfully that it could come back? And then what would be the next steps?
That's a good question.
I'm sure there's a lot of KI growers listening wondering that exact question.
Yeah. The risk of flies coming back, initially we thought it was really minimal. I mean, there's only 2 entries to KI. That's planes that come in twice a day, I think, at the moment. And the rest is the ferries, of course. I don't think there's many risk of flies arriving on a plane. So the only risk is the ferry. And then we say, well, there's actually not that many sheep coming to Kangaroo Island. Well, that's wrong, because the statistics show there's roughly 40,000 sheep a year coming to KI. Most of the sheep go off KI, that's obvious, but there's still quite a few coming to the island every year. So yeah, that risk needs to be managed, and we are trying to set up that discussion. We've already had some discussion with the people from biosecurity about how can you reduce the risk that sheep that come to the island would actually be carrying flystrike. There's a couple of simple things that you can think of, like they have to be off shears no more than, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks, which makes sense because you wouldn't bring sheep in with a heavy load of wool anyway. Can we go any further? That's a big question. That it is the industry on the island that needs to organize that. That's not my responsibility as a researcher, but we certainly happy to try and find solutions with them. And then, of course, if there would be a new outbreak, then yeah, we would have to go back to doing SIT to reduce that population. And that's going to be really tricky because it needs to be discovered quickly enough to try and reduce the area where you need to release flies, because you don't want to start all over again. So that's certainly something that will require a bit of attention of the industry.
Yeah, interesting. Excellent. Thank you to everyone for joining us today for our webinar. And Maarten, thank you so much for sharing your insight and expertise. AWI Extension South Australia's webinars are supported by Australian Wool Innovation, the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund, and the Department of Primary Industries and Regions.